For decades, Kenny Rogers was seen as one of the most open, familiar faces in music. His voice felt like comfort, his lyrics sounded like lived wisdom, and his presence gave the impression of a man who had nothing to hide. Fans believed they knew him. The storyteller, the gambler, the steady voice that narrated love, loss, and hard-earned lessons. He seemed transparent, grounded, and deeply human, someone whose life and music moved in the same direction, but behind that carefully maintained image was a reality far more complex than anyone imagined. While the world listened to his songs and followed his career, Kenny was quietly managing a life divided between what audiences were allowed to see and what he kept carefully protected. For nearly 30 years, he balanced fame, responsibility, and deeply personal choices without ever letting the full truth surface. It wasn't about deception for attention, it was about survival, control, and preserving pieces of himself that fame threatened to take away. The truth is, Kenny Rogers understood early on that visibility comes at a cost. The more beloved he became, the less room there was to be human without judgment. So he made deliberate decisions about what to share and what to keep private, building a second life away from the spotlight that allowed him to endure the pressures of constant admiration. That hidden world shaped him just as much as the music that made him famous. Only now does the full picture begin to emerge, revealing a story not of scandal, but of quiet endurance, emotional sacrifice, and the unseen weight carried by a man everyone thought they already understood. Kenny Rogers' public image was built on familiarity. He didn't present himself as untouchable or mysterious. Instead, he felt like someone people had known all their lives. His voice carried warmth, experience, and reassurance, and his songs often sounded like conversations rather than performances. To fans, Kenny wasn't just a star. He was a narrator of life itself, someone who had clearly lived through heartbreak, regret, love, and redemption. That sense of openness made it easy to believe there was nothing left unseen. Yet fame has a way of demanding access long before it offers understanding. As Kenny's career grew, so did expectations about who he was supposed to be, how he should live, and what parts of his life belonged to the public. The more recognizable he became, the more carefully he had to decide which pieces of himself were safe to share. Over time, those decisions formed a quiet divide between the man on stage and the man who existed away from the lights, a divide that would remain largely invisible for decades. Kenny learned early that constant exposure can erode personal freedom. Interviews, tours, appearances, and public scrutiny left little space for reflection or rest. Every smile was interpreted, every absence questioned. Rather than pushing back publicly, he adapted privately. He began structuring his life in a way that allowed him to meet public expectations while protecting his inner world. This wasn't about secrecy for its own sake. It was about preserving emotional stability in an environment that rarely allows it. Music became both an outlet and a shield. Through storytelling, Kenny could express emotions without revealing their origins. Songs allowed him to process experiences indirectly, transforming personal truths into universal narratives. Listeners felt his authenticity, but they never saw the full picture behind it. This balance, sharing emotional truth while guarding personal detail, became one of his greatest strengths and also the foundation of his double life. Behind the scenes, Kenny carried responsibilities and emotional complexities that never reached the public conversation. Relationships, personal sacrifices, and long-term decisions unfolded quietly, away from fan expectations. While the public focused on his success, he was navigating the realities of aging in the spotlight, managing family dynamics, and confronting the emotional cost of living under constant recognition. These challenges required discipline and restraint, qualities that rarely receive attention in stories about fame. What made Kenny's double life sustainable was his understanding of boundaries. He didn't rebel against fame, nor did he surrender to it completely. Instead, he carved out spaces where he could exist without performance. Those spaces allowed him to recharge, reflect, and remain grounded while continuing to meet the demands of a global audience. For nearly 30 years, this balance held, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. There was also a deeper emotional reason behind his discretion. Kenny understood that once personal details become public property, they are no longer controlled by the person who lived them. Stories get reshaped, motivations questioned, and private struggles turned into entertainment. By keeping certain parts of his life hidden, he maintained ownership over his identity. This quiet self-protection allowed him to continue creating without becoming consumed by the narratives others might impose on him. To fans, his life appeared consistent and stable. He toured, recorded, appeared, and smiled. But consistency can be misleading. Behind that steady presence was constant adjustment, a man adapting to change while ensuring the world never noticed the strain. Living this way requires emotional endurance. It means carrying truths without sharing them, making peace with solitude, and accepting that being understood fully may never happen. As years passed, this double existence became second nature. The public Kenny Rogers remained approachable and familiar, while the private individual learned to live with restraint and intentional silence. It wasn't a life of deception, but of compartmentalization, a survival skill developed over time. He didn't hide out of fear. He hid out of wisdom, knowing that some parts of life lose their meaning once exposed. Only now, with distance and reflection, does the depth of this dual existence become clear. Kenny Rogers didn't just sing about life's complexities. He lived them quietly, consistently, and with remarkable control. His story is not one of contradiction, but of coexistence, fame and privacy, openness and restraint, connection and solitude. Understanding this adds weight to everything he created, revealing that the man behind the music carried far more than anyone ever realized. Maintaining a divided life for decades always comes with a cost. And for Kenny Rogers, much of that cost was emotional. While audiences saw confidence, warmth, and control, his private world required constant compromise. Relationships, in particular, were deeply affected by the demands of fame and the boundaries he felt forced to maintain. Being loved by millions does not replace being understood by a few. And Kenny spent years navigating that delicate imbalance. Long stretches on the road created distance that could not always be repaired by good intentions alone. Touring was not just part of his career. It was the engine that sustained his public identity. But every departure carried emotional weight. Time away meant missed moments, delayed conversations, and a growing awareness that personal life was often arranged around professional necessity. Over time, this pattern trained him to prioritize stability over spontaneity, and caution over emotional openness. Kenny understood that relationships in the spotlight are rarely allowed to exist naturally. Even private connections risk becoming public narratives, shaped by speculation rather than truth. To protect the people closest to him, he often chose silence instead of explanation. That silence, while protective, could also create distance. When parts of a life cannot be shared openly, even those closest may feel only partially included. This quiet separation became one of the hidden burdens he carried. Emotionally, living this way required restraint. Vulnerability had to be carefully rationed, and trust was extended slowly. Fame changes how people approach you, and Kenny became acutely aware of how admiration can blur authenticity. As a result, he learned to keep emotional walls in place, not out of coldness, but out of necessity. These walls allowed him to function, but they also limited how deeply he could be seen, even by those who cared about him most. Another unseen toll was the pressure to remain consistent. Fans relied on him for familiarity, comfort, and a sense of continuity. Reinvention, which is celebrated in many artists, carried risk for someone whose appeal was rooted in relatability and steadiness. This meant that even personal evolution had to be managed carefully. Growth happened quietly, without announcement, and often without validation. Living that way can feel lonely, especially when the world believes you are surrounded by admiration. Kenny's emotional discipline became both his strength and his burden. He learned to compartmentalize feelings, setting aside personal struggles so he could show up fully for his audience. Over time, this skill became instinctive. Yet compartmentalization, when practiced for decades, can dull emotional expression. Feelings don't disappear, they wait. And carrying them privately for so long can create an internal weight that few ever notice. There was also the reality of aging in public. As years passed, expectations didn't soften, they intensified. The public image remained frozen in time while the private individual continued to change. Reconciling who he was with who the world expected him to be required constant adjustment. Admitting vulnerability or fatigue felt risky in an industry that rewards endurance and consistency. So he adapted silently, choosing dignity over disclosure. Despite these challenges, Kenny never abandoned connection altogether. He valued loyalty deeply and kept a small circle of people who understood the comp. The music told stories of wisdom and experience, but the life behind it required discipline, emotional endurance, and the strength to live with truths that could never fully be shared. Public perception played a powerful role in keeping Kenny Rogers' double life intact. From the outside, his career appeared steady, controlled, and transparent. Fans believed they understood him because his music felt personal and his public presence was warm and familiar. That familiarity created a sense of closeness that discouraged deeper questioning. When an artist feels relatable, people rarely imagine there could be an entirely separate world existing beyond what they see. Aging in the spotlight added another layer of complexity. As the years passed, Kenny faced the quiet pressure of remaining consistent with an image that had been formed decades earlier. The public expected the same voice, the same presence, and the same sense of reassurance. Change, when it happened, had to be gradual and carefully managed. Any visible shift risked inviting speculation or concern. This meant that personal evolution happened mostly in private, where it wouldn't disrupt the narrative fans had grown comfortable with. Nostalgia also worked in his favor. For many, Kenny Rogers represented a specific era and emotional memory. His songs were tied to moments in people's lives, relationships, reflections, and life lessons. This emotional attachment often made fans protective rather than curious. They didn't want the image complicated. In many ways, nostalgia acted as a shield, allowing him to live quietly without intense scrutiny. The public didn't look closer because they felt they already knew enough. Media coverage reinforced this stability. Interviews focused on career highlights, music, and storytelling rather than personal depth. Kenny was skilled at guiding conversations towards safe ground, offering insight without exposure. He understood how to be honest without being revealing, present without being transparent. Over time, this approach became second nature. It allowed him to maintain warmth and accessibility while keeping the most personal parts of his life protected. There was also a mutual unspoken agreement between Kenny and his audience. Fans wanted comfort, familiarity, and consistency, and he provided it. In return, they respected his boundaries even if they didn't consciously recognize them. This quiet contract helped sustain his double life. He never challenged expectations publicly, and the public never demanded more than what he was willing to give. That balance kept deeper truths safely out of view. Another reason the truth remained hidden was the absence of scandal. Kenny's life did not follow the dramatic arcs often associated with celebrity secrecy. There were no explosive revelations or visible contradictions between his public and private selves. His discipline ensured that the two worlds never collided in a way that drew attention. The separation was clean, intentional, and maintained with remarkable consistency. Without conflict, there was no curiosity. Emotionally, this required constant awareness. Living under observation means always anticipating how actions might be interpreted. Kenny learned to move carefully, choosing discretion over expression. Even moments of fatigue or doubt were managed quietly. He understood that public vulnerability could easily be misunderstood, reshaped, or sensationalized. So he chose steadiness instead, a calm exterior that concealed ongoing internal negotiation. The passage of time also contributed to the secrecy. As years turned into decades, the dual existence became normalized. What begins as a temporary adjustment can slowly become a permanent way of living. For Kenny, maintaining boundaries was no longer a conscious effort. It was a habit formed through experience. By the time reflection became possible, the structure of his life was already firmly set. This long-term separation between public and private life shaped how he related to the world. He learned to value peace over recognition and control over explanation. While others chased relevance through reinvention, Kenny maintained relevance through consistency. This approach protected his legacy while allowing him to age with dignity. But it also meant carrying truths that few ever heard, stories that remained internal rather than shared. Now, with hindsight, it becomes clear how carefully constructed this balance was. Kenny Rogers didn't live a double life because he wanted mystery or intrigue. He lived it because it allowed him to survive fame without losing himself completely. The public persona was not a mask, but a partial truth. A version of himself designed to connect without exposing everything. Understanding why the truth remained hidden for so long adds depth to his legacy. It shows that his steadiness was not effortless but earned. His calm presence was the result of discipline, self-awareness, and a deep understanding of the cost of visibility. The double life he lived was not an act of deception, but a strategy of endurance, one that allowed him to give generously to the world while keeping enough of himself intact to remain whole. Looking back, Kenny Rogers' life reveals a truth that is far more human than sensational. The double life he lived was never about deception or drama. It was about survival in a world that demands access without always offering understanding. For nearly 30 years, he learned how to give enough of himself to remain connected with the public, while quietly protecting the parts of his life that needed privacy to survive. That balance, while effective, came with emotional weight that few ever noticed. At the heart of Kenny's story is intentional restraint. In an industry that rewards constant exposure, he chose control. He understood that once personal experiences become public narratives, they are no longer owned by the person who lived them. By keeping certain truths private, he preserved his autonomy and emotional stability. This choice allowed him to age with dignity, avoiding the chaos that often follows artists who reveal too much too soon. There's a quiet sadness in knowing how much he carried alone. Not because he lacked support, but because some burdens cannot be shared without consequence. Living with constant recognition limits the freedom to process pain openly. Kenny learned to manage that reality with grace, channeling emotion into music rather than confession. His songs spoke honestly, even when his life remained partially hidden. In that way, his art became the bridge between what he lived and what he could safely express. His later years reflect the cost of long-term self-containment. When a person spends decades prioritizing stability over vulnerability, silence becomes familiar. The public may interpret that quiet as peace, but it often contains reflection, unresolved emotion, and acceptance. Kenny's life in those years was not empty. It was measured, intentional, and deeply private. The sadness people sense comes not from regret, but from the recognition of how much restraint was required to maintain that calm. What makes his story resonate now is the contrast between perception and reality. Fans believe they knew him completely because he felt accessible and honest. Yet the truth is that he allowed only what was necessary to be seen. This doesn't diminish the connection he shared with audiences, it deepens it. Knowing the discipline behind that connection adds weight to every performance, every lyric, and every public moment he gave. Kenny Rogers' legacy is not just musical. It is emotional. He showed that it is possible to navigate fame without losing oneself entirely, but also demonstrated the cost of doing so quietly. His life invites reflection on how much we ask of public figures and how little space we leave for them to be human beyond their roles. The double life he lived was a response to those pressures, not a rejection of the people who admired him. In the end, his story is about choice. He chose privacy over spectacle, dignity over disclosure, and endurance over momentary relief. Those choices shaped a life that looked steady on the surface, while carrying unseen complexity beneath. They allowed him to remain present for his audience while staying anchored to himself. That balance, though heavy at times, defined the man as much as the music did. Understanding this hidden side of Kenny Rogers reframes the way his life is remembered. It reveals that strength often looks quiet and resilience rarely announces itself. His journey reminds us that living well does not always mean living openly, and that sometimes the most meaningful truths are the ones carried privately. Kenny Rogers didn't just sing about knowing when to hold on and when to let go. He lived it. For 30 years, he held on to what mattered most, while letting the rest remain unseen. And in doing so, he left behind a legacy not only of songs, but of self-respect, emotional wisdom, and the courage to live on one's own terms even under the brightest spotlight.